Before you relax, before you let your shoulders sink, before you tell yourself that this is just another voice, another story meant to fade into the background, you need to understand something important, something most people never realize until it is already too late. There are places in this world that do not chase you, do not threaten you, do not reveal themselves through fear or violence because they do not need to, they only need to be noticed. Because attention is the only permission they require to exist more fully. And once that permission is given, once you linger just a moment too long on something that feels slightly wrong, slightly misplaced, slightly out of alignment with the rest of reality, it begins to adjust itself around you, quietly, patiently. And if at any point during this story you feel the urge to check the time, or you notice that the silence in your room feels heavier than it did a moment ago, or you sense that the space around you has become more aware of your presence, then you should understand that this is not imagination, it is recognition, and recognition is where this always begins. It was 2:17 a.m. exactly. Not nearly, not approximately, not rounded down by a faulty clock, but precise to the minute, glowing softly on the digital display beside my bed. And I remember thinking that the exactness of it felt aggressive somehow, because coincidence does not behave with discipline. Coincidence does not return night after night with the same careful timing. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to my breathing stretch the silence thinner and thinner, I realized that the quiet in my apartment was not natural, not the calm quiet of sleeping neighbors or distant traffic finally dying away, but restrained, deliberate, as if sound itself had been instructed to wait, to hold its position. And this realization did not strike me suddenly. It grew slowly over many nights, because by then the dream had become a constant, returning without fail, without variation, without mercy. Every time it began the same way, without transition, without warning, with me already inside it, already moving forward down that corridor at a pace I never chose, my footsteps echoing just slightly out of sync with my movement, delayed by a fraction of a second, as if the sound belonged to someone walking behind me rather than beneath me, the walls too close, too tall, their faded beige paint cracked and uneven like old skin stretched over something that had grown underneath. The overhead lights buzzing softly, flickering often enough to remind me they could go out completely at any moment but never quite doing so. And there were no windows, no signs, no emergency markings, nothing to anchor the place to any known building, only apartment doors lining the corridor like markers in a sequence that felt intentionally incomplete. And eventually, always eventually, I reached the same point, the place where the corridor seemed to pause and wait for me to catch up. Where apartment door 7 stood on my right with its metal number scratched and loose, apartment door 8 beside it with its plaque hanging crooked and tarnished, and a few careful steps ahead, apartment door 10, clean, straight, almost newer than the rest. And between 8 and 10 there was the door that should not have existed, the door with no number at all, no outline where one had been removed, no discoloration, no residue, nothing, as if the concept of numbering simply did not apply to it. And the longer I stood there, the stronger the sensation became that the door was not waiting for me to open it, but watching me notice it, registering my attention, learning the shape of my awareness. And each night when I woke from this dream, my mouth was dry, my heart racing unevenly, and the clock beside my bed glowed the same time, 2:17 a.m. again and again. And instead of relief, I felt as though I had been interrupted mid-thought, pulled out of a place that continued existing without me. I tried to rationalize it, because my life was built on monotony and repetition, because I worked as a municipal archive clerk in a government building so old that sunlight barely reached the lower floors, a place that smelled permanently of dust, paper, and forgotten decisions, where my days were spent scanning housing records, blueprints, ownership transfers, eviction notices, inspection reports, documents that described lives no one remembered anymore. And over time, I had grown comfortable with being invisible there, with touching things that no longer mattered to anyone, until the morning I arrived at my desk and found a thin folder waiting for me, labeled simply 312. And the moment my fingers closed around it, a cold unease ran through me, subtle but immediate, like a reflex I did not consciously choose. And as I flipped through its contents, my stomach tightened, because everything inside appeared normal at first glance. The address, the construction permits, renovation logs, inspection stamps, until I reached the third-floor layout where the apartment numbers moved cleanly from 8 to 10, skipping 9 entirely. And this alone might not have unsettled me if the architectural blueprints had not clearly shown a ninth apartment, complete with walls, plumbing lines, electrical wiring, and an entry door placed exactly where the door in my dream stood, and written in red ink along the margin of the file. Older than the rest of the text was a single sentence that felt less like a note and more like a declaration: door number removed. No initials, no date, no explanation. And when I searched the digital registry, the system returned nothing. Not deleted, not archived, simply non-existent, as if apartment 9 had never been approved to exist at all. From that day forward, the building began appearing everywhere in my thoughts, uninvited, persistent, and the dream intensified. The corridor narrowing further, the air heavier, the buzzing lights louder, the floor beneath my feet faintly elastic, subtly responding to my weight like something breathing beneath the surface. And when I reached the unnumbered door, it no longer waited. It opened slowly on its own, revealing a room flooded with harsh white light that burned my eyes, and sitting at a metal table inside was me. Older, thinner, my skin dull, my eyes hollow. My posture collapsed inward as if gravity behaved differently there. And when he looked at me, there was no shock in his expression, only exhaustion and recognition. And he whispered so quietly, it barely carried, "Do not close the file." And then I woke gasping, choking on the dryness in my throat, the clock glowing too, 17 a.m. yet again. And from that moment on, the world around me felt subtly misaligned, as if I had noticed a seam I was never meant to see, as if reality had folded slightly out of place around my awareness. The next morning, the folder was gone from my desk, and when I went down to the archive storage room, shelf B12 no longer held file 312, but in its place sat an unlabeled folder containing a single photograph of the apartment building's entrance, and standing in front of it was a blurred figure wearing my jacket, my shoes, my posture frozen mid-step. And when a voice behind me asked if I was looking for something, I turned to see my supervisor watching me too closely, his gaze lingering longer than it should have as he said, almost conversationally, that some doors were never meant to have numbers. And that sentence followed me home, echoed in my thoughts, growing heavier with each step, until that night I stood in front of the building again, its entrance dimly lit, its stairwell lights slow and reluctant, the air thick with dust and something sour I couldn't name. And when I reached the third floor, the hallway matched my dream perfectly, down to the spacing between the doors. And when I pressed my palm against the wall between apartments 8 and 10, it was warm, soft, yielding slightly under pressure, and after a few seconds I felt movement beneath the paint, followed by a quiet internal clicking sound as the wall separated to reveal the unnumbered door waiting patiently behind it. And as I opened it and stepped inside, I understood, with a clarity that terrified me, that this place was not hidden. It was simply patient, waiting for someone willing to notice it long enough to be recorded. And as the door closed behind me and the light shifted, I realized that somewhere, in a room very much like the one I had just left, another thin folder was being placed gently on a desk, unlabeled, still warm from recent handling, waiting for the next pair of eyes willing to linger just a moment too long.